welcome everybody. Welcome to the fourth, I think, event in our PPE in a time of pandemic series. We're going to talk today about the idea of a universal basic income, and our guest is Karl Widerquist, one of the leading experts on the idea of a universal basic income. Karl is an associate professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, Qatar. He has published several, I think 7 books. Some of them are on universal basic income. So one is called Independence, Propertylessness, and Basic Income, a theory of freedom as the power to say no. Another book is an anthology on basic income. He has written on the Alaska dividend, and most recently a book on UBI experiments. Okay, and so many Americans just recently got their stimulus checks, or officially they are called, I think, economic impact payments. And even though these were not exactly a universal basic income, at least they brought back the, or maybe not back, at least they put the idea of an emergency universal basic income onto the agenda. And but we're going to start to talk about universal basic income more broadly before we get to the idea of emergency basic income later. So Karl, maybe we just start by, well, you explaining what a universal basic income is.
Sure. Universal basic income is the idea that you can have a market economy, or really any other kind of economy, where income doesn't have to start at zero. The way the system is set up now, and most systems around the world, are if you don't have a job or some assets bringing money in, your income starts at zero. Our default is you default to homelessness. And that's kind of a cruel economy. And the idea among UBI activists is that we don't need to be this harsh and this cruel to make the whole system work. Have a small income that goes to everybody that's enough to meet their basic needs. And then on top of that, you make more income, and some of that might be taxed back. But if your other income goes to zero, you still always have this basic income coming in every month, no matter who you are, rich or poor alike. There are similar ideas where you means test it and only give it to those whose income is low. That also puts a floor under everybody's income, but that doesn't really save you any money. And this system where you're giving cash to everybody really works best for the people who are most in need. It works for you, the person who's on the margins of homelessness. It works for you better if you get a check every month, and Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett gets a check every month too. They're going to be paying billions of dollars in taxes. Don't worry about them. We can get some money back from them. But it goes to you partly because it'll create some solidarity between everybody throughout the middle class and the working class, but also because it is there when you need it. If you have basic income and it's coming in every month or every week, or even in a small increment every day or something, if you suddenly lose your job for an unexpected reason, it's there. If you suddenly have to flee your husband, and suddenly it's there. You don't want to get to the woman's shelter and find out that you've then also got to make a call to the government to say, oh, I'm not part of this family anymore. I need income. Can you please evaluate me? You want a basic income that's there all the time. This payment that we're getting is a step towards basic income. It is to most people who've paid taxes in the past year under a certain amount. So the people at the high end aren't getting it, and the people at the lowest end aren't getting it, which is the second one is really trapped. There's people who are most hurt by this are actually the ones who are not getting any checks at all. The homelessness and the homeless people and the people who can't prove that they're getting something. So this check is these checks that are going out are a step towards it, but they're not quite there.
Thank you. So unconditional in several respects, right? And unconditional what your other income is, unconditional whether you want to work or not, unconditional on, well, many other things as well, I guess. Before we move on, I forgot, I should say, Karl and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then everybody will have the chance to ask a question. and we have 20 minutes or so for the Q&A. So, but getting back to UBI. So, like with any proposal, like policy proposal, there are some arguments in favor of it. There are some worries that people have about it. Maybe we go through some of the arguments that people have made in favor of universal basic income. So most recently in the US, it was certainly Andrew Yang who made very prominent the idea of universal basic income again. He called it the freedom dividend. And so what he emphasized a lot is how a UBI is the best answer to automation. So many people will lose their jobs, become unemployed because they will be replaced by machine. And he talked a lot about truck drivers who will lose their jobs to automated cars and so on. Is that an argument that resonates with you, that you find powerful and or one of the strongest arguments in favor of UBI?
Well, in a way, but I think people are talking the wrong way about automation and UBI. They're stretching the future. When you want to talk about automation and UBI, you need to stress the present and the past. When they say, oh, machines are replacing jobs, someday machines are going to replace most jobs and a whole bunch of us are going to be out of work and there's just going to be massive unemployment sometime in the future. That could happen. It's not crazy that could happen, but it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened yet. There are pretty much, well, before this latest crisis, there are pretty much the same numbers of people working now as there were 50 years ago. The trend has seemed to have been that eventually when you lose jobs to automation, somebody creates jobs somewhere else. There's no proof that will go on forever. That went on, it seemingly went on forever for horses. For horses, people invented stuff, they invented technology, and it was always put more horses to work until 1910. Then the automobile started spreading, and by about 1920, hardly any horse in the United States had a job anymore. Except for hansom cabs and racehorsing, and that was a small percentage of the horses who had jobs. Now, so it could happen. This argument that people are making that it could replace most human labor, it could happen. But that's like saying, well, the obvious response to that is, well, in the distant future, when that does happen, then we'll have UBI. But there's a bunch of automation reasons to have UBI right now, which is, one, if you have automation and you replace this job and you create that job, you are usually it's not the person who lost this job who gets that job. You replace, say you get automated trucking. Truckers lose their jobs. Some of these truckers are 55 years old. They've been driving a truck for 30 years. That's what they're skilled at. And they're not going to become the next computer programmer. They usually will drop down to the bottom of the labor market and start all over, and they never recover before retirement. Automation disrupts people's lives. No matter even if it is good for people in general, it hurts specific people. Basic income helps cushion that blow. It helps you also, if you lose your job for something like this, it gives you some income to rely on when you're doing retraining or something like that. It's very important to cushion that blow for the creative destruction that the economic system is always doing. But then there's another, and I think maybe centrally more important at this point, and that is, in the last 50 years, the political economy of the United States and really most of the Western industrialized world has changed so that the average people have not been sharing in economic growth the way they have been. For the 50 years leading up to that, we'd have economic growth and the working class would be better off, the middle class would be better off, the upper class would be better off. Everybody would share in the gains. Since about the mid-1970s, we've had great healthy growth on average, a few recessions here and there, but really healthy growth on average. Lots of new automation, lots of new stuff, lots of things we could produce. We've got double the size of the economy that we had in the mid-1970s. That means we could all be consuming the same as we consumed in the 70s and working half as much. Or We could be working the same as we were in the 70s and consuming twice as much. But most of us are working as hard or harder and consuming 1 or 2% more. All those gains have gone to the top 1 or 2% of people in the last 50 years. Basic income, and you have some taxes on the people who are benefiting most from this and distribute it to everybody else, everybody who has been involved in all of that automation. We've all been a part of it. You've done any sort of job in the last 50 years. You've been part of what has created this amazing growth.
Thank you. If I may just quickly follow up here, I mean, I understand how that cushion would be a good idea, but why does that speak in favor of universal basic income in contrast to a means-tested program? So why not make the argument, the same kind of argument for a kind of safety net where the benefits only go to those who actually lose a job and not to everyone? So why does it support a UBI and not something else, a different kind of safety net?
Mm-hmm. Well, any of UBI is it one thing is, as I said, it's always there when you need it. It's very, with a complex system that we have, it's really hard to qualify for something. You've got to show you've got this problem to get this and that problem to get the other thing. And a lot of the people who need it or who need it aren't very good at filling out forms, or they get sick of filling out these forms and they get sick of being judged. Mm-hmm. Means-tested programs tend to be very judgmental. What got you in this horrible circumstance? These programs are for those other people, those bad people, those people down at the bottom who most of us never expect to be in that position. So we create judgmental policy and say, how do we fix this person? What can we do with this person? The programs that work the best are the ones that are aimed at everyone, like Social Security, where it's not a judgmental policy, at least once you qualify for it. It's given to almost everybody who retires, and it is not constantly under attack, and we're not always trying to judge the people who are on Social Security. Unemployment insurance is a little better for that than most of the other ones. TANF is hugely judgmental. Food stamps is also paternalistic and judgmental, telling you what you can buy and what you can't, and often what you can buy with food stamps is not what people most need. Another reason to do it on basic income is basic income also works as a subsidy for relatively low wages. Is that if you lose your job entirely, you got a basic income that's high enough to live on. But if you then get a job that pays lower wages than you used to, basic income effectively works as a subsidy. Whatever taxes you're paying on this new lower income job are not as much to balance out that basic income you're getting, so you're actually getting more. Basic income goes not just to people who is a net benefit. There's my dog barking. It's a net benefit, not just to people who are completely not working, but to people who are at the relatively low end of the wage spectrum. And you can structure it so virtually the entire lower half of the income distribution benefits from it. So it benefits everybody at the low end. And that not only is a direct benefit to everybody who gets it, but it creates something better in the labor market. It gives the recipients way up into the middle and upper class the power to say no. They don't need a job. They take a job because they want a job. They're not taking it because they're about to lose their home and become homeless. They're taking a job because it has good wages and good working conditions. I've got a great job. I'm a professor at Georgetown, Qatar. I get great pay, great respect, great working conditions. You could offer me a $20,000 a year basic income, and I'm still going to do this job because they give me these good working conditions. But we have horrible jobs that are dangerous, that are cruel, and that are really low paid. If people have the ability to say no to these jobs, then you get better pay, better wages, and better working conditions in this job. So better pay for the meat packers, better pay for the janitors, better pay for the teachers, better pay for the child care professionals, better pay for the elder care professionals, people that we should be treating like professionals more than we are now. People will be able to bargain for that if they have more power.
Right. Another argument that some have made in favor of UBI, for example, in the Finland experiment where a UBI was tried out, I think 2017, 18 or 16, 17, I'm not sure, where the main rationale was to lower the unemployment rate. That's at first sight kind of in tension with the Andrew Yang argument. So there it is to help people get unemployed, right? And in Finland, the main rationale was to, well, have less people unemployed, right? But maybe you just kind of a little bit explain why a UBI could really help with unemployment and bring more people into the labor force.
Well, the Finnish experiment was only an experiment on what would be the effect of UBI on people who are currently on Finland's version of unemployment insurance. Finland's version of unemployment insurance is extremely generous compared to the US version. The US version, unless we're in a severe recession, it runs out after, I believe it is 6 months. It runs out after a fairly short period of time. In Finland, it runs out after, I think, 3 years. So you've got it for a very long time. And the idea was that they were thinking that that if you had a basic income, which you don't lose when you get a job, and you gave it to people instead of unemployment insurance, some of those people who've been sitting on unemployment insurance for 2 and 3 years would go out and get jobs. And they found not a huge effect of that, but they did find that people were happier and better off and more trusting of the system. They felt less exploited by the system. We found in experiments in the US and Canada that were conducted in the 60s and 70s that basic income-like policies do very, very beneficial things in improvements in health in infants, a decrease in infant mortality, decrease in admissions to mental hospitals for psychiatric emergencies. Really, and better education for children. That's one of the most difficult things to do in direct education intervention among low-income kids, is to get them to perform better in school and stay in school longer. You find out if their parents aren't as poor, then they do better. The solution to better performing kids in school is to have fewer kids in poverty. So basic income can do a lot, and we shouldn't just focus on its effect on unemployment.
Yeah. Which, as far as I know, in Finland there was no such effect, right? But there might also have been the reason that it was just for 2 years, and these other programs were still in place, and so on.
Yeah, there was not a huge effect on unemployment in the Finnish.
Okay. Before we move on to like some of the worries that people have about UBI. One thing I find interesting about, many people find interesting about UBI, is how it gets supporters from both the left and the right. So there are also very, from classical liberals who are just in general very market friendly and very skeptical of state interference. So some classical liberals also support UBI. Like, I mean, Milton Friedman supported negative income tax, which is not exactly the same thing, but at least, or one could conceive it as a type of UBI, maybe with a specific a way to finance it. Anyway, can you just in a few sentences maybe explain how and why classical liberals, what they like about UBI?
Yeah, well, Milton Friedman actually, at the end of his life, within the last 2 or 3 years of his life, he did an interview with Eduardo Suplicy, the Brazilian senator who was a big basic income supporter. And Milton Friedman said that he did not consider basic income an alternative to negative income tax. He considered it a negative income tax. He said it's just a different way of doing the accounting. So he looked at negative income tax and basic income as the same thing. So he was not opposed. He was for basic income as much as he was for negative income tax. That tends to be the view. There tends to be a lot of people who think, well, the two are really equivalent, and other people say, well, basic income's better, and other people say negative income tax is better. Now, the appeal to the left tends to be centered around two things: an end to poverty and more power to the working class, and some other things, greater equality and things like that. Now, the appeal to the right of center tends to be more of the market-oriented people on the right of center, and not so much the conservative end, but more the classical liberal end. What you see there is that the system that we have, which is made to promote very conservative values, but does it very poorly, is to judge people. We judge people. We say, okay, you're poor, so you're probably bad, and you might be trying to cheat us. So let's have a bunch of systems in place to judge you, and then we're going to knock off all of these people, and then we're going to include these other people. And what you find is everybody feels like a criminal then. If you're eligible for anything, you feel like a criminal. You begin to resent the people that are running these programs, and some people that by any standard of whatever you believe the truly needy is, by any standard, some people who are truly needy are not getting it because of the difficulty of the testing. Then you have other people that don't meet your standard and they are getting it. Then you have the expense. You have this huge expense of hiring all these people to do all of this stuff, printing up the special food stamps, the money that is paternalistic, and the people that are going to judge whether you're good enough to get that. And we're feeling, and that is an expense not just in dollars, but in efficiency. We're feeling the effects of that right now. Probably, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people participating in this have sat on the phone trying to get unemployment insurance during this crisis. Just the fact, all we want you to do is call in and say you lost your job. And when there's a huge increase in unemployment, we can't handle the phone calls. Basic income doesn't need that. The checks are always coming. I would like to see it so it's a direct deposit. You get a direct deposit into your account from basic income every week or every day, and then you get your paycheck minus the deductions. Your paycheck goes away, the deductions go away, and suddenly that basic income that's coming in every week is really significant. It's right there for you. That efficiency is something that appeals not just to people who are on the left, but appeals to people who are classical liberals, who don't want to judge people, who want people to be free, and also don't want to be in a cruel economy. And basic income is one way to have an economy that is not cruel and doesn't have homelessness, but also doesn't have a lot of really cumbersome, difficult policies. So it streamlines the welfare state or the welfare system for classical liberals, while at the same time it makes it more effective for modern liberals. So it's good for people on both sides of that spectrum.
Maybe what classical liberals also just are not fans of is bureaucracy, right? So I mean, this efficiency means also that you need just much less bureaucracy to administer this kind of safety net. Right? Yes,
and I think it was Matt Zwolinski who said one thing the government is really good at is sending out checks. Was that Matt Zwolinski? Anyway, he's a classical liberal who's also a big supporter of basic income. You get rid of the bureaucracy, the government is sending out checks in a way that is effective to do something that we all have good reason to care about, building society without poverty. And I think that appeals not just to people who have really learned a lot about libertarianism and classical libertarianism and all these things, but just to regular business people. I'm a successful person, and if I can pay slightly higher taxes to live in a world or a country where there's no poverty, that's a good thing for me, especially if the taxes are collected in a simple, effective way and they're given out in a simple, effective way. And that's why I think you have people like Elon Musk and Chris Hughes and other people who are big in the new tech industries and things coming around to basic income.
One difference, though, between supporters from the left and classical liberal supporters will probably be that some of the classical liberals will want the UBI to replace a lot of other programs, right? While at least some coming from the left will also want to keep some of the means-tested programs, right?
Yeah, that is part of the reason that the negative income tax didn't pass in the early 1970s. This compromise between streamline and make it more effective was on the table in the late 60s and early 70s, and a very watered down bill that was kind of like a negative income tax, but bringing in some of that paternalism, was passed by the House of Representatives and in 1971 and lost narrowly in the Senate. And that was 71. And in the 72 election, both Nixon and McGovern, with all they disagreed on, both put a version of basic income in their platform, or at least said some good things about it. But then, Watergate and all this. But the compromise that they came up with was trying to please everybody and ended up pleasing very few people. You got a little bit of the negative income tax streamlining for the classical liberals, but they didn't replace that many programs. Then they made it really low and added in some paternalism for the conservatives. And then the low effort of it put off the welfare rights activists. So it was kind of like an in-between policy that pleased no one. I do think a compromise where you're streamlining things, where you're streamlining as you make it effective, is possible. But to do that, it's going to have to be a very generous basic income. There was a guy in New Zealand that was talking about it as the big kahuna, where he was saying, you've got to do this all at once because it's got to be big enough that it really can replace this stuff. Because it's a bad deal. It's because otherwise it's a bad deal for people who care about making the poor better off. If you're replacing a bunch of stuff for a really small basic income, a lot of people are going to be a lot worse off. And they don't want that. Even if it's more comprehensive, if a lot of people that are at the margins or even farther, that's bad for them. And then they've lost all these other programs that they fought for years. Whereas if the basic income, if you don't replace all these things, then you lose people on the classical liberal side. Milton Friedman was famous for that, of saying back in the 70s that if it doesn't replace a bunch of other stuff, he's not going to be for it. So you got to get one that's large enough. I think actually you can get where you can phase something in without replacing a lot of other things. See how it works. Replace things as needed. But there are some things that you cannot replace by it. I can't imagine a basic income high enough that everybody can buy their own health insurance, and in this country where health insurance is so expensive, and pay all those copays. Nor do I think that basic income can replace the public school system, that we're all going to start paying private tuition out of our basic incomes. That would be ridiculously high. And then the people who don't have kids would be making out crazy. So we do need to keep things like public schools and public streets and public health programs, special things for the disabled, special things for the elderly. It can't replace those things, but it can replace just about anything aimed at propping up people's incomes. And that includes things like the housing benefits, the tax credit for buying your own home. Basic income could replace that and make a lot of people better off. There's a lot of things that you could replace for it if it's generous.
All right. Let's move on now to some of the worries that people have about UBI. So one of the most straightforward worries is, I guess, that it just looks like a waste of resources on the rich. So if you want to help poor people, why? I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but maybe it's nice to bring it, to have it clear on the table again. So that's a worry many people have, right? It's just a waste of resources. Bill Gates and others just don't need that monthly check. So why send it out? Well, could you just say
Sure.
a few words on that?
Yeah. Well, I already said more about why you should send it out, because it's really good for the people at the margins that it goes to everybody. Now, but why? So what I need to explain here is why people shouldn't care that you're giving a check to Bill Gates. Is that Bill Gates, when he does his taxes and has his withholdings every week, let's say he's making his, I don't know what he makes per week or something. Well, let's just take somebody that makes, let's just take not him, but somebody makes $1 million a year or something. They're going to be paying, say they're paying $400,000 a year in taxes. Okay. Now, what you're going to do, you're going to add, and that's coming out mostly out of their withholdings, let's say. So it's actually a salary job, just for illustration. You're going to take to that, and they got their $600,000 net out of that. They get their check, they get their withholdings taken out, they get $600,000 left. Okay, you're going to add to that a basic income of say $15,000, and you're going to subtract from that a tax of $15,000. So he's got his basic income and he's got $15,000 more in taxes. That is what makes basic income different from negative income tax, is that you're adding and subtracting this money. Well, it doesn't cost you anything for the government to give you a direct deposit slip that says, oh, look here, we added your basic income and we took out a little more in taxes. Mm-hmm. That actually just exactly counteracted that basic income. So you're not wasting any money by giving it to the wealthy. You're getting it back from them in the taxes.
Okay, but then you
doesn't harm them, doesn't distort their behavior or anything.
I mean, some people prefer to have the universal basic income funded in other ways, right? I mean, Andrew Yang, for example, emphasized a lot that a consumption tax would be a better. I mean, he wants to have a mix of funding sources, right? But I mean, many people like the idea of covering a lot of it with a consumption tax, which, well, everybody will face. The reason is that you don't want to make work more expensive, right? You don't want to tax income because, well, that disincentivizes working in a way. So
it works the same way. It works the same way if it's VAT tax financed. If you are making $1 million a year, and you're paying 800, you're spending $1 million a year, and you're paying 200,000 of that in VAT. Okay, we're going to raise your VAT tax a little bit, and we're going to give you a basic income. So your basic income is you're going to get this basic income, but then your VAT spending is going to be a little more. Your VAT tax is going to be a little more. We're going to raise the rates on you or something. So you get it and you give it back. It's no matter how you're taxing people, as long as you're taxing the wealthy and you're giving the basic income to the wealthy, you are giving them cash, which is really just dollars marked on their bank account, and you're taking cash, which is dollars marked on their bank account. Oh, your bank account goes up, goes back down. It doesn't mean anything.
Right. Okay, but with a consumption tax, there's a greater likelihood that it hurts the poor more, the increased taxes, isn't that?
Well, I have never been a fan of the VAT. I have not researched Andrew Yang's VAT proposal and his arguments why he thinks VAT is the best way to go. Nor have I know Scott Santens has, and he's a big basic income supporter, and I trust him, and Andrew Yang has done a lot of good work. I have not looked at this stuff closely. Now, what both Scott and Andrew Yang, Scott Santens and Andrew Yang have both concluded is that when you have a VAT tax, 55% of that actually ends up coming out of corporate profits, and only 45% gets passed on to the consumers. And they claim that that is a better way than the wealth tax for actually getting at corporate profits. And that may be true. I haven't looked into it. I'm open to a lot of ideas. I don't claim expertise when I don't have it. I don't have expertise on whether VAT income tax is a better way to get to it, or wealth tax. I've read good things about the wealth tax, and what Andrew Yang says is we tried these wealth taxes in Europe and they didn't work, and most countries got rid of them because they didn't work. I'm a little skeptical about that. My guess is that these were bad wealth taxes that were watered down and resisted by powerful, wealthy people that didn't want a good wealth tax. And that's why there were bad wealth taxes, and they were gotten rid of because powerful people also had a lot of influence and wanted to get rid of those wealth taxes, not necessarily because they didn't work. But I can't say I have expertise on that. I think we get a better wealth tax and a government that's more responsive to the people, and we can do it by a wealth tax. But there's other ways. Capital gains was originally treated as any other form of income. Now it's way lower. Most wealthy people make a lot of their income off capital gains, which is taxed less than what the rest of us make. So most of us are paying higher rates than the most wealthy of us. And that's a aggressive idea. The rates on the wealthy should be at least as much, if not higher, than everyone else. So counting capital gains as any other income is another way to do it. taxes, one thing I'm a big fan of is taxes on what people own instead of what people do. Taxes on the value of land, taxes on things the government gives away. We give away the broadcast spectrum to the TV companies, the cell phone companies, the Wi-Fi companies, anything that broadcasts anything. The government gives that away for free. They add value to it, but they don't just charge you for the added value. They charge you for the fact that they own part of the broadcast spectrum that they got for free. We should be renting the broadcast spectrum to the highest bidder. The government gives away money to banks at really low interest rates, and the banks lend it back to us at higher interest rates at virtually no risk for them and big risk for us. There's so many ways to get to government-created privilege through these kinds of taxes and fees that I'm not sure that we are even going to need increases in VAT tax or income tax if we have to finance basic income.
All right. So we start a little later, so I think it's okay if we talk for another 5 minutes or so. Before we get to the Q&A, just one question now to bring this back to coronavirus. So, I mean, I think about a month ago or so, there were these, or maybe it was 2 months, I'm not sure, but there was a discussion about having an emergency universal basic income here. And then we ended up with these, what is the official name again? The economic impact payments. And they are, well, not emergency universal basic income. Can you just talk a little bit about how that is different, why it's worse or better, maybe, the policy we have now compared to emergency universal basic income? Oh, please.
Well, it is very interesting the way basic income was immediately on the table when this hit. In 2009 and in 2002, during the last two recessions, there were payments similar to the one that was sent out. They were smaller, but there were similar kinds of payments that were near universal, not quite a basic income. And these payments went out, and nobody talked about this as having anything to do with basic income. Now everybody's talking about it as basic income or step towards it. And Spain has even taken a policy that has virtually nothing to do with basic income. It's actually really just a more generous version of unemployment insurance. And they're calling it basic income because basic income is on the table. That's the success, not just of Andrew Yang, but Andrew Yang is actually more of a result of the basic income movement than the spark of the basic income movement. The basic income movement has been growing for the last 10 years in ways I've been watching just with my mouth hanging open. It seems to double in interest every year. When Yang dropped out, I was prepared, okay, it's going to go down for a while. Then this coronavirus hit, and people are talking about it more than they were when Yang was running. But what we find is people want to call things basic income more than they actually, the people in power anyway. They want to call things basic income without actually doing it. You need a payment for everyone. Democrats were obsessed with means testing and didn't want any of these checks going to the wealthy. The wealthy have a bunch of other things they're getting from the stimulus. A tiny amount of these stimulus is going for this payment. Just give the wealthy those little checks and cut down on the big giveaways that we're giving to banks and connected businesses. Then they also left out people who needed it most, the homeless and the necessary. And it was too small, and it was one time. What I would like to see would be $2,000 a month for adults, $1,000 a month for children for 4 months to help everybody weather this crisis. Now consider what that does. And this is nothing to do, and no increase in taxes, because we're in an extraordinary moment. We're in a demand crisis, so we have more latitude to spend without taxing it back. We can tax it back later when the economy recovers. And we don't have to take out loans to do this. We just can create money out of thin air, like the Treasury does all the time. Create money out of thin air and give out these checks to absolutely everybody. Now you do that, then all of us who've lost our jobs and have to stay home, we've got a cushion. Okay, we've got money that for most of us is going to pay our rent. If $2,000 for every adult and $1,000 for children is not enough to pay your rent, you were doing pretty well before this crisis. So now then the then you do this for 4 months, and that does not only the people who've lost their jobs, but the people who are still working, the people that are working at your checkout counter at Walmart and Whole Foods and the corner store and the hardware store, the auto repair shop. Auto repair is essential workers, and those people are out there getting exposed to this virus all over the place. Transportation drivers, the medical people, all of these people are going to get those checks for 4 months. They get bonus pay. So the people who can't work get a cushion pay, and those who we still need to keep working are getting bonus pay for still working. And that creates the good incentive. Now you want to be one of those people who's still working very often, but you're not desperate to be one of those people who's still working. You're not, those people who have jobs are a lot better off because they got the basic income and the income. But those people who can't get jobs have the basic income and and that's enough to get them through this crisis.
Thank you so much. I would now ask about inflation, but I think we have to move on to the Q&A and open this up to everybody. Ryan, do you want to moderate this?
Great, I do want to moderate this. So what we'll do, because we don't have the Q&A writing in system in place, is if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask a question. In the meantime, though, a couple questions came in through the mail. I'll ask one question while people are thinking of one. This is from Bertrand, and Bertrand asks, it says the cost of living in different areas of the country varies significantly. Why shouldn't the amount of UBI vary along with the cost of living?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question, and that I think is one of the questions about basic income where I have to say there's no easy answer that's really a good answer. Now, because the cost of living is really, really, really different across the country. And so if you give a basic income that's the same everywhere, and you say, okay, we're going to go to the cheapest cost of living, I don't know, rural Mississippi, and we're going to get everybody who lives there out of poverty with a basic income, give the same basic income to everybody. Then people who live in New York or San Francisco going to be deep in poverty. But if you give it high enough to the people in New York and San Francisco to be out of poverty, and you give it the same everywhere, then you make it very expensive, and you're being very, very generous to people who live in other places. And you're also giving people an incentive to move to those cheapest places, which is not necessarily bad, but it can be bad. I'm not sure whether it's good or bad to give people in New York an incentive to move to rural Mississippi because their basic income goes farther. Now, another way that you can do it then is to adjust it exactly by the cost of living. So it's going to be wherever you live, it's going to meet the cost of living at that place to keep you just out of poverty. It's going to reflect that perfectly. That, though, gives you more incentive than you otherwise would have to move from the cheap rural areas into the big cities. So that has problems as well. I think and maybe there's a happy medium. Maybe there's a medium where you say, okay, we're going to adjust it partially for the cost of living, but not enough to fully compensate you for being in the expensive place, so that you are ahead by living in the cheapest place, and you are a little bit behind by living in the expensive place, but not as much as the natural difference between those two. That's one way to do it, and that could be supplemented by non-basic income policies to look at why is housing so expensive in certain areas of this country and so cheap in other places. What government policies have created this situation? It is something that is very much created by lots of government policies, by our zoning laws, but also about the way we regulate investments and allow a lot of speculation to just push up prices on speculative values. So there are things we can do to reduce the difference in cost of living.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions. We have one from Ian. Ian, I'm just going to allow you to talk. I'm going to unmute you and go ahead and ask your question when you're ready.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. This is something that Fabian, I think, was about to talk about right at the end there. But I'm curious what you think about the worries about basic income, that they're going to drive inflation and ultimately inflate a good part of its value away.
Sure. I think that's a question that does have an easy answer, is that basic income is not special spending. All government spending creates inflationary pressure. When government buys stuff, it pushes up the price, buys stuff or gives people money that they're going to buy it. That creates inflationary pressure. When the government taxes or takes out loans, that brings money back in to the treasury, and that creates deflationary pressure. And it's the job of the government to balance the inflationary pressure of what they're spending with the deflationary pressure of what they're bringing in. Now, but it's not that simple, because there are things in the private economy that create inflationary and deflationary pressure themselves. So it's not a one-to-one thing. We do not have to have a balanced budget every year, and we don't have to sell new government bonds to make up the difference between what we spend and what we bring in a year. There's amount that we can always spend over what the government brings in without creating too much inflationary pressure. The complicated thing is that amount changes. It changes. In a boom time, that amount gets smaller and smaller and maybe gets negative. In a boom time, we might have to have more taxes than we have spending if we need to put the brakes on the economy and we're getting lots of inflation. But in a time like this, what we're in right now is a highly deflationary environment. When people stop spending and businesses stop investing and banks stop giving out loans and all of this stuff happens, money goes back into the banking system and dies. It doesn't circulate anymore. It doesn't come back out. It goes there and it dies, and that creates deflationary pressure. What the economy needs now is money. So right now, we can afford to put a bunch of money in without putting in a bunch of new taxes. That won't be true when the recession's over. And this is something that governments have traditionally been bad at, but they've gotten better over the years. If you look at the bouts of inflationary and deflationary spirals that we were having 150 years ago, they were horrible. And it was bad in the recession, in the Great Depression. They did the opposite of what they needed to do. We've been getting better and better at it over time, but we're still not that good at it. We need to get better at it. We need to pump some money in the economy now and tax back what we need later.
Oh, Isabel has a question. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and go ahead and ask your question when you're ready.
Hi, yeah, I'm just wondering, how likely is it that that's going to happen? Because like one of the things you mentioned was certain laws, like zoning laws, housing laws, there are certain things that are preventing people from closing a wage gap. You know, historically, we have such a strong wage gap between the rich and the poor. Like, how likely is it that policymakers who have these senses of privilege are going to have enough empathy to do that? Well,
yeah, I think I started working on UBI because when I was really young, I thought poverty was the biggest remaining problem that we have. Now I say, well, okay, we're also killing the environment that sustains us, and our government is actually controlled more by donors than it is by voters, and we're also really militaristic. Those problems are just as big as the issues I set out to work on. This is what I specialize in. To do some of these things, we have to solve some of these other problems. We either have to get the very wealthy to be really sympathetic with everybody else, or to see that it's actually not really in their interest to have such an unequal society. You can be fabulously wealthy and live in a world that doesn't have any poverty in it. And it'll be better for you in the long run. There's all kinds of research that shows this. We can count on, within the existing system, trying to get greater empathy from this group. But the best thing to do, and the most successful countries in the world that have, for as far as happiness and standard of living and democracy and equality are the ones where the people have been most successful in taking control of their governments, including Finland and Norway and Denmark and Iceland, where they found ways to get more power to the people and less power to the corporations. A great example in Norway, 70% of the resources they get from oil exporting go to the government. In Alaska, it's been about 30%. The other 70% goes to the oil companies. So, but yet both countries find oil companies willing to drill stuff up. That is the power of having a government that is willing to run a hard bargain with it. We need another Teddy Roosevelt or a Theodore Roosevelt who'll really stand up to people, but we also need really greater democracy and get the money out of politics. And that's a lot of electoral reforms that we need to do these sorts of things.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have a question from Grady. Grady, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I was wondering if, I'm sure this depends on a lot of different factors, but I was wondering if you found any kind of guideline to what the right amount, is there like an upper limit where UBI starts to have some negative effects? Like what's the right amount per month or year or whatever?
Well, that changes. That's of course going to change every year with the inflation level and with the growth level in the economy. So I've given up trying to keep up with the dollar amount, and I wrote a paper called "The Physical Basis of Voluntary Trade," where I argued that you have to have one that's, well, it's most desirable to have one that's going to meet everybody's needs, their basic needs. One that's enough for food, shelter, clothing, some basic transportation, and a cushion so that people don't display the kind of effects that we see of what desperate economic individuals do. And there's lots of evidence about that to look at. So that's what I use as a guideline. The U.S. poverty measure is supposed to measure your absolute needs. It's a really terrible measure. It is based on what people bought when they created the measure in about 1960. And then food was expensive and rent was cheap. And so they based it on some percentage of what was it? It was based on some simple formula that's not remembering right now. I think it was some percentage of your food budget, what a basic food budget was cost, but food costs have gone down, rent costs have gone up. So it's gotten further and further removed from what you really need to live in this country. So our measure is very poor. Last time I checked in 2015, to get everybody out of poverty, official poverty, to get the you needed about $1,000 a month per person and about $500 a month per child would do it. That's 2015. That's 5 years ago. That's official poverty. So I'm looking at something I think more like $20,000 a year per adult and $10,000 a year to child might be better. But the exact dollar amount I've not researched lately, and it keeps changing every year. So don't hold me to those figures. I think one thing that you need to do when you're committed to this is, like, you don't want it to be too high. If it's too high, it's gonna be bad for everybody. It's gonna be unsustainable. It's either gonna create high inflation or high unemployment or other problems. But you don't want to be too low, because poverty and homelessness are horrible things. We need to get rid of them. So what you need to do is to start at a decent amount and work it up. If we have a really responsive government to the people, and this is what we care about doing, and this is what the people decide to do, we could start it at the poverty level and then raise it a little bit every year and see how that goes. That, I think, would be a decent method, given the political economy of the country, where you never know if you're going to finish something you started. I'd probably want to start at a higher level so we get the commitment to that. Start at 150% of the poverty line or something.
Fantastic.
All right, thank you.
So we have some questions that have come in through other means. This is a question from Sonia. Sonia writes, America has a massive immigrant labor force, many of whom are undocumented. Should immigrants, undocumented or otherwise, have access to UBI? And if not, what will this mean for the social equality and labor dynamics between immigrants and citizen labor?
That's the right question. That's a very good question. People usually, when they talk about immigration or UBI, they usually ask all the wrong questions. Like, doesn't that mean all those poor people from those poor countries are just going to come here and take it? Well, we control our immigration and we control who's eligible and how long they're eligible. We don't have to worry about immigrants coming and taking our UBI because we decide how many we let in and we decide whether they get it. That's not a problem. But what's this person's name?
Sonia.
What Sonia's talking about, that is the problem. The problem is not that immigrants are going to come in here and take it, is that we might be really generous to each other. The citizens might be generous to each other and then just let a bunch of immigrants in, whether legal or undocumented. We're going to let a bunch of immigrants in and then not give it to them and then give them really poor wages and exploit them. And that also creates then a difficulty. Well, we have to have some amount of immigration. My preference is for open borders, is that if I want to go and live in Tibet because I like mountains, I don't think somebody should stop me because somebody drew a line on the map and said, this is ours and that's yours. I'm for open borders. In the world we live in, I don't think they're very practical. Unfortunately, I want to move as far as we can in that direction. Now, how to do that? How to do this without exploiting immigrant labor? Alaska has a tiny basic income, not enough that you can live on, and it's been gutted recently thanks to a series of problems. But they give it to all legal residents. At least everybody that's been there for, I think, about 2 years. Everybody gets it, including non-citizens, everybody who's intending to stay. At some point, I don't think we shouldn't be exploiting people and then sending them home. So I think people who come should be eligible for citizenship. And I think there has to be some waiting period before you get basic income. And then you should be eligible just like everybody else. And you gotta create that window long enough to give people, to not give people too much incentive to just come just for this, but also not one that's going to allow us to just be exploitive of the people who came. This is one reason why I think we would still need a minimum wage, even if we have basic income. And the minimum wage, we got to take the holes out of the minimum wage law. The minimum wage law is designed to have holes in it to leave out undocumented aliens so that we can hire them as migrant laborers for our farmers and pay them next to nothing and treat them horribly. And a bunch of other businesses are getting away with this and act like it's their fault instead of the employer's fault. We blame the immigrants for wanting and needing low jobs. We should be having a minimum wage that if you violate that minimum wage, even for an undocumented laborer, then you're in big trouble. So that would create the set that if immigrants are coming, they're coming for the same wages that everybody else is getting. So something along those lines, but it's a difficult issue, and I'm glad that she brought that up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I mean, we have several other questions, but I think we're running short on time. So with apologies to all those who weren't able to have their questions asked, I'm going to turn it back to you, Fabian.
I would just like to thank you, Karl, for joining us. I thought it was really, really interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot.